Welcome to
Okay, let's
another
go.
off season.
Wait, hold on.
Dude, what are you doing?
I was just telling you I was ready to go.
Don't tell me you're ready to go as I'm starting the show. Welcome to another off season D3 Datacast. Zach Snyder and Matt Snyder here, continuing our NPI summer series. Having some fun playing around with NPI because the fun thing about it is we can get real concrete answers as we play different scenarios. We don't have to worry about, okay, if a resume looked like this, how might the committee have viewed that? Where would that maybe stack up? No, we can run results. We can change results, play around with different scenarios, and know exactly how NPI turns out. And that's the new system that we're under in terms of how teams are selected and seeded for the national tournament. So it's a lot of fun. Today we're going to be looking at a big question. Does NPI give everyone an at-large chance? Because observers under the old system, I think, probably knew that there were going to be certain strength of schedule numbers under which teams just didn't have a chance, right? We saw, particularly if you had a SOS number that started with a 4, like it kind of seemed like at that point you were just written off. You almost couldn't win enough games with that kind of strength of schedule number to garner a lot of favor in the eyes of whether it would be a rack at the regional level or the national committee. So with NPI, we can play around with results, start swapping losses to wins, and taking a team that maybe had a very poor strength of schedule and taking a look at, well, could they have maybe won enough games to, even with one of the weakest schedules in the country, turn themselves into an at-large viable team?
Yeah, we knew with the old system because the committees had to weigh these five discrete kind of buckets against each other. There ended up being cutoffs, a 500 strength of schedule cutoff. If you were below that, or if you were significantly below that, we knew you were basically not going to be in consideration for an at-large bid into the tournament. Now with NPI, the SOS figure, which is your opponent's NPI for each game, gets baked into the calculation. So we still have a number. So we can say, did a team's schedule, if they won enough games, if maybe they went undefeated against their schedule to a conference tournament final and then lost their first game in that final, would maybe the lowest strength of schedule teams have had a chance to get into the tournament or not? And that's what we did this week, Zach, for this episode.
And I feel like we have to say it. We say it all the time that we're doing some sort of comparison or contrasting between NPI and the old system. There is a strength of schedule component, but that's not the same thing, right? That was a different strength of schedule computation. And in previous critiques of the old system, right, there was times that we even brought up, well, how well is this actually describing the overall strength of schedule? Under the new system, the strength of schedule is just the total average of opponent NPIs, right? And so what we're going to do today is look at who, according to NPI, had the absolute lowest strength of schedule, total strength of schedule for the entire portion of their entire schedule, not just whatever portion may have been included in the NPI calculation, and start flipping results, right? Take some of those losses and play around with it to see what happens, right? I mean, we really approach this as a question. Does NPI give everyone an at-large chance, not knowing the answer? And that's kind of the fun thing, is playing around with NPI, and you can answer a question like this. So let's get into it, Matt. Looking at last year's final NPI data, taking a look at total strength of schedule, it was Martin Luther out of the UMAC who ranked dead last. Now, they happen to have an actual record of 7-17 against Division III opponents, but in those 24 games, taking their total opponent NPI, that being what their strength of schedule is, that ranked last. Everyone else had a total strength of schedule better than Martin Luther. So the question is, could Martin Luther have won enough games with that schedule to give themselves a chance at an at-large tournament berth? Certainly wasn't going to do it at 7-17, but if we change some of those 17 losses at some point, do they get there?
So
So
Zach,
that was the scenario we ran.
the first scenario we ran was, okay, what if they won all those games and then we assigned them into the UMAC tournament? Would they have gotten in? If they would have gotten in, then we would have backed off a game, and then we would have backed off a game and seen what would that record have been. So the first scenario here was a one-loss Martin Luther team, and here's how it kind of ended up. They were 25-1 against D3 opponents, and this actually allowed Martin Luther to climb up to the NPI number 38 spot, which, as happenstance turned out, they would have been the first team out of the tournament the way that everything ended up in real life 2025 basketball. So Martin Luther would have not made the tournament even at 25-1 given last year's, but it put them right on the bubble. They would have been in that bubble conversation. They would have been watching all of those conference tournaments right up until the last day to see, do we have a chance to make it if some of these Sunday results go our way?
Right. So, very interesting how it just so happens it puts them right at what would have been the first team out. So Matt, just going back to the big question at the top, does NPI give every team a chance? They're right there on the doorstep, so certainly could have been, a chance, but it depends on the number of upsets. Of course, during conference tournament time, we're always looking at bid thief scenarios and how that really can shrink the bubble. And so, their viability would have been very much impacted by the number of bid thieves, so to speak.
And what did we have? Like 4 or 5 bid thieves last year. It was fairly average, I think, at the end of the day. But one would have made a big difference to Martin Luther. So they were not easily describable as either in or out of the tournament had they gone, whatever this was, 25-1.
So just by point of comparison, Matt, prepping this show, I think we had a little bit of I don't know if I would say disagreement or maybe a disconnect in how much we wanted to actually talk about numbers in the old system. But just for point of comparison for people who are well versed in that, running those old SOS numbers, Martin Luther would have had a 440 SOS, which people would easily identify as a team that would be certainly labeled as having an SOS problem, if not just outright written off.
Yeah, they and I mean we would have written them off of the discussion in the old system with a 440 SOS. But to be clear, the old SOS and the new NPI strength of schedule component are going to be very different. And there was issues with the old system, and while NPI is not perfect, I don't think we want to just call a 440 SOS a 440 SOS and move on. But yes, they would have just missed. They would have had a 440 SOS that would not have been viable under the old system, but they maybe would have been bubbly. Kind of in this scenario. And actually another comparison, just because we're talking about the old system, even though I did not want to talk about the old system at all. With this 440 SOS, I don't think they would have been even in the Region 9 rankings at all. I think they would have been a spot or two out of the Region 9 rankings, just very quickly looking at what those rankings could have looked like with this SOS. So they would have been out of the region picture. They would have been out of the national picture. It would have been no shot for a 25-1 team to get in under the old system. And again, new system, they would have been in the bubble conversation, maybe in, maybe out.
So playing the the weakest schedule in the country, of course, just to go into the more fullness of the kind of the old system, be like a 961, 962 winning percentage, the 440 strength of schedule, and a 0-0, right? Because when you're playing a quote-unquote bad or weaker schedule, you're not getting any of those games against regionally ranked opponents. So for people who want to think about kind of the old system comparison, kind of the 961, 440, 0-0, you want to play the game, how might that have been handled under by a regional committee, by a national committee? Matt, under your old system, probably wouldn't have been even in the regional rankings, much less at large viable. All right. So let's look at another case, Matt, because if you just go up one spot in the NPI strength of schedule rankings, the second to last strength of schedule belonged to Lion, a team who did have a little bit more success at 17-8 against Division III opponents. But that 17-8 record was only good for NPI number 200 overall. Still, winning about 2/3 of their games, but with one of the lowest strength of schedules out there that only let them hit the number 200 mark, compared to where Martin Luther was at 7-17, being number 380.
And for the people yelling at their screens right now, we know that Lion was a provisional and not eligible for the tournament last year. They were a year 3 provisional team, but they happened to have the next lowest strength of schedule. So we played a what if they had this scenario, and then what if they were tournament eligible? Would they have been in range? Because we know what the NPI range would have been. So Lion will be eligible this next year for the tournament. They weren't, but we still ran them for this case study.
Right. So being third year provisional, they're included in the rankings because games against them count for their opponents, but they themselves were not eligible for the NCAA tournament. But hey, we're playing with what ifs here,
Yeah.
so we can look at Lion, and it doesn't really matter whether or not they technically were or were not eligible. All right, so starting, that only gives 8 games to change, or 7 games to change, because if we're talking about at large, you have to have a loss there somewhere. So flipping losses here, Matt. What's the difference here with Lion being one spot being second to last in strength of schedule as opposed to Martin Luther being last?
Yeah, so Lion would have been 26-1 against D3 opponents. Their NPI would have been number 37, and I just kind of let the cat out of the bag. Gettysburg would have been pushed out, and Lion would have received the last spot in the at-large process for the NCAA tournament. So they would have. I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? If the worst SOS would have been kind of right on the edge, then maybe the second worst is just in, and it was just enough to get them just in. So second worst strength of schedule, the way things played out last season, would have gotten into the tournament or would have had an NPI to qualify them into the tournament had they gone 26-1 versus their schedule, which was a loss in their conference tournament championship game. So that's, running the old system numbers for Lion, it actually would have come out 438, would have been just a touch lower. I think it was 440 for Martin Luther. This would have been 438. So definitely no shot at the at-large under the old system. But here, the way things played out, a team like Lion, they were 17-8, so a team like Lion wasn't getting into the tournament. But had that team gone 26-1, we could have seen them in the tournament last year.
With that exact schedule, right. So 963 winning percentage, 438 strength of schedule, 0-0 against regionally ranked opponents. It's a shiny winning percentage, but I think based on what we've observed in the past, probably would not have been enough, again, to even get into regional rankings, and certainly not into an at-large bid. But here, viable under NPI.
Yeah, and right. Viable. I mean, I think, and in the conversation, I think you and I were both interested to see it came out right around the cut line. I think that was kind of interesting, or where the cut line ended up being last year. I think in neither of these cases, I think we would have been concerned if they would have been like a top 10 seed or top half of the at-large process, and it would have been easily in if they had been 26-1. That's not the case. The best case scenario, if these teams ended up winning a bunch more games than they actually won, they would have been on the bubble and been sweating it out to the very end. One team would have missed, one team could have made it. So it doesn't really look like having, just playing the easiest teams in Division III is going to be a hack to easily get you into the tournament. It might get you in a conversation that you wouldn't have been a part of in previous years. The SOS would have been a disqualifier, and in NPI, maybe there's some reason to look at you. But for both of these two teams, they would have been, bubble in, bubble out.
And going back to last summer when we started taking a look at NPI, how it might play out, some of the implications, some of the differences, I think it was one of the very first differences we saw is that it was definitely going to make a different set of teams that were just kind of cast aside, not getting consideration under the old system, that would be able to get some greater consideration. Right there in the past, there have been teams that quote unquote had an SOS problem that we knew from, whether you're talking like eye test, human voter top 25 type analysis, or whether you're talking about like efficiency ratings or Massey ratings, like there were always those teams that we knew, like in a real basketball sense, kind of stacked up with a group of teams that were getting consideration, but because of the way that the primary criteria numbers happened to come out, it was like, when it came to regional ranking and selection time, they really were not considered on equal footing.
Yeah.
So we knew that some of those teams that maybe looked like a 490 SOS under the old system, that were just kind of, like, oh, we got better options or other options to bring to the table, like suddenly they were going to be seen in a better light with NPI.
Well, and we knew in the old system who the worst teams in your conference would have a big effect on your SOS. games that you're going to win by 20, 30 points, but you have to play them twice, or maybe you have two bad teams in your conference. That's 4 games really dragging down your strength of schedule because it was your entire your entire schedule kind of averaged together to make your strength of schedule. NPI has the ability, once you reach the minimum wins threshold, to drop wins that would otherwise hurt you. So as long as we keep 12.5 in men's basketball, 12.5 wins. Women's basketball keeps 15 wins. We have to make sure that everyone has a baseline of games that we can look at. And then after that, we're not really worried so much about maybe who the worst 5 or maybe even 10 teams at an extreme level were on your schedule. We're worried about more at what was the top. So in an NPI sense, even these teams like Lyon and Martin Luther, had they only had a single loss all season, would drop a bunch of their games, their lowest rated teams, and that would help them with their SOS a little bit. Whereas under the old system, there was no ability to do that. So we were measuring teams to some degree by who their worst handful of opponents were, not just who are the good teams that they did beat.
Okay, so we've danced around it a little bit. So let's go back to our big question. Does NPI give everyone an at-large chance? Man, I think the answer that we've come to is kind of, right? And it seems like so much of with NPI, the answer to just about anything is it depends, right? So that's what we kind of come to here. The 2 lowest strength of schedule teams that we looked at from this past year, Martin Luther and Lyon, could have played themselves to the bubble had they gone undefeated until a theoretical conference tournament final, right, Matt? But just being right around that cut line means that they were still subject to certain factors outside their control. We talked about the number of bid thieves, right? As this past conference tournament week played out, like it seemed kind of early on that it was going to be a very low bid thief environment. Then that as that final day played out, maybe it got to be a little bit more average. The number of at-large bids, right? We've seen that vary over the years. Sometimes it's been, in more recent years, I think we've seen 20, we've seen 22, we've seen 21s, right? So if you're talking about a team that's going to be right around the cut line, it's like, well, making a cut at 20 versus 22 is going to make a difference. And then just based on the number of bids and the number of bid thieves, in recent history, as we looked at NPI going back to last summer, we were looking at the 3 seasons prior. Now with the season we just saw play out, kind of looking over the past 4 years. If you apply NPI, even though NPI wasn't how teams were selected or seeded, if you apply it to those previous seasons, we've seen historical at-large cut ranges from number 30 overall to number 44 overall. So in that sense, looking at Gettysburg being number 37 overall this past year, this kind of right in the middle of what we've seen from the high end and low end. But looking at these 2 cases, how viable they might be in a very low, in like a high at-large bid, low bid thief environment, pretty viable, I think.
Yeah.
But if you get into one of those scenarios where there's maybe fewer at-large bids just based on the number of AQs, or you get just absolute carnage in a conference tournament, then maybe they become like the 5th team out.
Yeah. And we looked at 2 extreme examples. We looked at the lowest 2 SOSs in the country, and they were right at the bubble. So likely 80-90% of Division III does have a chance to get into the tournament in most seasons. Even these had a chance to get into the tournament this year. So basically everyone does. These things depend. But I don't think what we saw was that it was any sort of hack to sail your way into the tournament. Just schedule these bad teams. You're going to get into the tournament. No problem. The worse your schedule is, I think we've kind of said this throughout the season, it changes your margin for error. These programs were on the at-large bubble because they lost one game. You have to lose a game. You have to lose your conference tournament. Everyone except for the UAA has a conference tournament. Otherwise, you would have won the AQ. So you have to have a loss to get an at-large bid. So there's at least one. So you've used, just getting into that at-large pool, you've used up your entire margin for error if you're one of these low SOS schools, and you're already at the mercy of the bubble. If you just have a weak schedule in general, maybe you're not one of the worst teams out there, maybe you can have 1 or 2 losses and still get in. We haven't really seen teams like that very recently, Zach. I think just before the show, we were kind of casually looking. Maybe the closest thing like that would have been Pitt Bradford had they lost their conference tournament. Maybe like a 3-loss Pitt Bradford team would have been out, or in. I forget what the cut line was, but they maybe would have run into this.
I mean, they finished with 3 losses, but did get their AQ, but they were kind of below that cut line, right?
Yeah.
So if they had gone the regular season with 2 losses, taken that third loss in a conference tournament game, they would have been like out as a 3-loss team.
Yeah.
Now, based on teams that actual finishes, I think the lowest loss total that did miss was Whitworth with 4. And just to the other side of the coin, let's look at Stockton, who got in with, was it 8 or was it 9?
8 or 9 losses.
It was
right?
8 losses. Yeah. Who got in with 8 losses, right? So when we're talking about your strength of schedule giving you your margin for error, it's kind of ranges from maybe anecdotally 8 with what we saw Stockton as the highest loss total this past year to down to possibly just 1 with the cases we've looked at here.
I think it's also
it could be it was even higher than that. Maybe there was some that's not to say Stockton necessarily had the number 1 SOS according to total SOS according to NPI. Maybe we should have actually looked at that, and that would have given us a better number for actually like what that range for margin of error is. But just again, anecdotally, the highest number this past season that had an at-large bid was 8.
And I think in this conversation, I mean, it might be surprising to say that the lowest strength of schedules in the country could have played themselves onto the bubble at the very least. So you might look at that and say, well, we should just schedule really easy because we can win a bunch of those games, so we can have a chance. There's a lot of reasons to be careful about that. One is you can't actually control your entire schedule for most teams. Like if you're coast to coast conference, you have some ability to do that. But even they have a conference tournament, right? So you're gonna lose games. You have a conference schedule, so you're gonna play a single or double round robin, 1.5 times through, whatever. If you even have 1 or 2 other competitive teams in your league, we're talking about razor thin margins for error. 1 loss here, these teams would have been on the bubble, maybe out. 2 losses would be really difficult. Teams like Pitt Bradford couldn't have handled that third loss. Whitworth had 4 losses, was out, and Whitworth's in a conference with some other reasonable teams, right? That's just not like just completely easy strength of schedule there. They're out with 4 losses. So knowing you have to take a loss to be in the Pool C picture, the at-large picture in your conference tournament, knowing you might have a couple other 50-50 games in your conference schedule just as it is, man, I would hate to just schedule patsies in my non-conference and then lose 2 games, lose 3 games, and be out of the tournament altogether when you could have put a little bit more meat on your schedule, gotten wins that actually help you, and play your way into the tournament rather than just hope you don't lose some of these games.
Right, and even if it was a hack to fill your schedule with cupcakes to be able to get into the tournament, right? We're still talking about these teams with 1 loss being ranked, number 38, number 37, right? So this is certainly not any sort of strategy to get near hosting, or it's certainly not top 8. All right, those are teams that are going to have 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 losses against largely really good schedules, in part because they're going to be playing a lot of other good teams. Likely from their conference schedule, but they're also playing non-conference games against really good competition. So Matt, really, I think this helps highlight that in NPI, it's very important to balance winning games with some sort of strength of schedule, right? It's not enough just to win everything against no one, but it's also not going to help you much to lose everything against really good competition, right? It's not a scheduling competition in that, hey, just fill your schedule with really good teams, and it doesn't really matter how well you do, right? You're not gonna lose your way in by playing the best teams. You're not really gonna win your way in by playing the worst teams.
Yeah. And NPI, we've seen a lot of disparate types of schedules get into the tournament. You mentioned the NJAC team, Stockton, had 8 losses, got into the tournament. I think UAA, University of Chicago, probably had 7 or 8 losses, got into the tournament. We know that these are teams that are playing other good teams in their conference, probably a non-conference as well, scheduling good quality teams. You're going to take some losses when you do that, but NPI says that's still okay. You can still get into your tournament. You can still be a reasonable seed in the tournaments. I don't think either of those teams were too low of a seed in the national tournament as well. Or if you were one of these weaker schedule teams and you just had like a really heck of a season, there's a path for you to get into the conversation as well. Whereas under the old system, you might have just been eliminated from the conversation because you had one number SOS that was a little bit too low. NPI will allow both of those types and kind of everything in between to a large degree get into the conversation. And it's just about how that balance actually hits of who do you play and who do you beat and kind of what combination those are. How much of that quality win bonus are you getting and the like. I think that really matters. And I think we can see these different types of teams have a shot under NPI.
So, Matt, I think the key takeaway for me is it's not good to play a very easy schedule when you're capable of getting wins against a higher caliber of schedule, right? If you're playing a schedule that you're basically going undefeated against, chances are you could be doing reasonably well against a higher level of competition, and that's where you want to be, so long as you don't overshoot and suddenly start dropping a bunch of games, right? So again, it goes back to that mix of winning games and playing against a reasonably strong schedule, right? Playing, beating the best teams that you can, not just beating any teams you can.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And especially if you're a team that has designs on being a first weekend host or maybe trying to get into that top four picture, you need quality on your schedule, or else you're just not going to have an NPI that's high enough to do that. So I think whether you're just trying to get into the tournament or host rounds when you're there, you want to be conscious of, you don't want to overschedule. I think we've said that in recent episodes as well, but you want to schedule teams nearby you in competition level. You want, some competitive games, maybe some from a tier below or so, but I think that mix will probably benefit you the most, and it will also be beneficial as maybe more of a conference strategy to help get your league, maybe that second at-large bid into the tournament as well.
Well, that's a good point about the league, right? It really is to everyone's benefit for every team to be kind of maximizing their NPI potential. Even if, you're a team that doesn't have, you're not quite at the level, you're trying to build maybe to the level where you could be winning enough games against a strong enough competition to be at that kind of at-large cut line or at-large consideration, being in that mix of teams. But, the better you're looking in NPI, the better games against you are going to be looking for other teams in your conference, right? So maybe there is that tier above that of a conference that they are at that level. Well, it really is to the conference's benefit for everyone to be looking as good as possible in NPI. And we've developed a little bit of a program here to offer some more individualized recommendations and advice to programs who are looking to go that next step, to take some of the general advice that we've given, some of the general conclusions that we've come to in the content we put out, and really apply it on a more specific basis to their program. We're calling it D3 Concierge, Matt. We launched it earlier this summer. Details can be found at d3datacast.com/concierge. And really, really grateful to have seen some positive reactions to that announcement. And it's a fun program.
Yeah, we talked to a couple of different coaches too who seemed really excited about the information. We know right now schedules are kind of locked for next year, but as we go into the season, coaches programs will be putting their schedules together for the following season. So we'd like to be a part of those conversations. If you want to maximize your NPI, you can reach out to the D3 Datacast guys here, and we will be glad to help.
All right, that wraps up this episode. Let's get out of here, Matt, with a word of thanks for our great supporters through the Patreon platform, patreon.com/D3Datacast, of people who, have basically taken on a voluntary subscription, right? We don't have a strict subscriber model. We're not putting, the NPI information or the efficiency ratings, on a site littered with ads or paywalls or anything like that. No, we have a great group of supporters who have voluntarily decided to support us, and we are grateful for their ongoing support.
And these supporters get our episodes a little bit early in early access. We also have a Discord server that people can get access to by joining our Patreon as well. So we're just really thankful for people who have joined in us in this D3 conversations and helping us to produce our D3 Datacast episode, Zach. But it was another fun episode talking about NPI. But for today, we're going to have to say, good job, team.